Wired.com presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here is your host, David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 286 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. Our guest today is Britt Wray. She's the co-host of the BBC podcast Tomorrow's World, and is currently working on a PhD in science communication at the University of Copenhagen. And we'll be speaking with her today about her new book, Rise of the Necrofauna, The Science, Ethics, and Risks of De-Extinction, which is about using breeding, cloning, and genetic engineering to resurrect extinct species such as woolly mammoths, passenger pigeons, thylacines, aurochs, and more. And before we get to the interview, I have a very important announcement for our Patreon supporters. Next week, Patreon will start charging a processing fee for every episode that we release, which means that everyone who's supporting us on Patreon will be paying a lot more, and virtually none of that money will be going to us. So what we're recommending is that instead of pledging $1 or $2 per episode, that people switch their pledges to $5 per episode with a monthly max of $5, or $4 per episode with a monthly max of $4, etc. So for example, if you pledge $5 per episode with a monthly max of $5, you'll be charged $5 when we release our first episode of the month, and then you'll be charged nothing for any other episodes that we release that month. So in effect, this is a way to switch everyone from pledging per episode to pledging per month, so that you only have to pay the processing fee once a month rather than every single week. Making the switch will save most of our listeners about $10 or $20 a year. And if this whole experience has soured you on Patreon, remember that you can also make one-time or fixed monthly contributions to the show via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. If you listened to our last episode, you may remember that just a week ago I was encouraging everyone to go sign up for Patreon because it was such a great company. So I don't know what happened. These new fees came completely out of nowhere, and the continuing lack of communication from Patreon on this has been completely baffling. I don't know what's happening behind the scenes over there, and I don't want to blame Patreon too much until I actually know what's going on. Patreon has always seemed like something that was too good to be true, and maybe it was. It may be that they're starting to run into financial or regulatory realities that they didn't expect. I don't know. So anyway, I'm not saying that Patreon is evil or that no one should ever use Patreon or anything like that. Geek's Guide to the Galaxy would literally not exist without Patreon. If you're a longtime listener, you may know that before Patreon, I ran this podcast for about 5 years at a huge financial loss, just because I always wanted a show like this to exist, and because I wanted to talk to and promote some of my favorite authors. But I always figured I'd have to throw in the towel at some point. Patreon transformed Geek's Guide to the Galaxy into an actual business that could survive for more than just a few years as somebody's passion project, and I'm very grateful for that. But I'm also very grateful to everyone who's helped support us, and those people need to be aware that under the current policies, pledging $1 or $2 an episode on Patreon is just not a good option. If you're still really confused about all this, and I wouldn't blame you, you can find more details on our Patreon page over at patreon.com/geeks, and you can also hit us up with questions on Twitter, @GeeksGalaxy, on Facebook, facebook.com/geeksguide, or via email at geeksgalaxy@gmail.com. This has been a very nerve-wracking week for me, and for everyone who makes a living thanks to Patreon. Dozens of our listeners have canceled their Patreon pledges, modified their Patreon pledges, made one-time payments via PayPal, signed up to make monthly payments via PayPal, signed up on Patreon for the first time, and then modified their pledge, and then modified their pledge again, and then canceled their pledge, and then signed up on PayPal instead, etc. At this point, it's just way too much to keep track of, and I really have no idea what my income will be this month, let alone next month. So I apologize if I'm not able to thank everyone individually the way I usually do, but please know that every contribution is very, very much appreciated. All right, so now let's get to our interview. All right, so we're here with Britt Wray. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you.
Okay, so I want to start out and talk about Jurassic Park. So tell us about George Poinar.
Oh, interesting. Yes, so George Poinar Jr. is an entomologist with expertise in ancient DNA. Back in the 1980s, before ancient DNA was even a sorted field, he and some of his colleagues were thinking about how to recover DNA from very, very, very old insects. And they had some blobs of hardened amber that were encasing different insects, and they hypothesized about what could have been inside those hardened amber blobs. It looked like some of these insects had engorged, reddened bellies, meaning that they had sucked the blood of other organisms, and they thought, well, we've done some dating. We see that these specimens lived around the same time as the duck-billed dinosaur. Maybe that blood could have come from dinosaurs that they had fed on. And this led to some interesting hypothesizing over a meeting that happened in Bozeman, Montana, which was one of the first meetings of an ancient DNA research group to ever occur. And they came up with a method by which you could possibly extract DNA from inside the belly of those insects, meaning that you could actually get the blood molecules out and potentially sequence the DNA. And then, if it were indeed DNA from a dinosaur, they'd be able to potentially cobble that dinosaur back by working with its genetic blueprint. Now, they didn't do any experiments to test this at the time. They were cooking up an interesting idea, and they published it in a university journal just as a fun thought experiment. But Michael Crichton read this and was aware of this thinking that came from the group and called George Poynor Jr., asking if they could discuss, because he was working on a project that this experimental thinking could benefit. And George Poynor Jr., therefore, became one of the foundational scientists to actually influence the science that went into Jurassic Park, because, as you've probably already guessed from listening to that explanation I just gave, it sounds a lot like what Jurassic Park puts forth as a way that you could have actually recreated dinosaurs from petrified, encased mosquitoes that were prehistoric.
And you say that George Poynor Jr. was kind of kicking himself that he didn't write Jurassic Park?
That's what his son, Hendrik Poynor, told me, yes.
And you say that Hendrik was he was a consultant on the first Jurassic Park movie?
Yes, and he got to go on set when he was still just a young biology grad and say, okay, your DNA sequencers shouldn't look like this, they should look like that, and I'll do all sorts of art direction as a young budding biologist.
But then you say also that actually probably this technique of extracting dinosaur DNA from amber is not going to work.
Yes. It's been tried, and no one has ever recovered decipherable DNA sequences from old specimens of amber-encased DNA from those times, from millions and millions and millions of years ago, because dinosaurs disappeared nearly 66 million years ago. And so being able to work on those timescales when DNA degrades so heavily as it becomes ancient is a real technical problem, and no one has been able to get over that.
Right. And so you say in your book that there are a couple of different ways that you could maybe sort of resurrect these extinct species. And one of them is breeding. So I'm kind of wondering, if I wanted a velociraptor and I had a bunch of chickens, could I just eat the chickens that were the least velociraptor-like and just keep doing that generation after generation until I had a velociraptor?
I'm not sure I follow your reasoning on this one. How so?
Well, so if I eat the chickens that are the least velociraptor-like, then the surviving...
If you eat them.
Yeah, if I eat, because they're chickens, right? And
yes.
I eating chicken. And then the more velociraptor-like ones would be breeding with each other, right? And so if I just kept doing that, would I eventually breed a velociraptor from a chicken?
Well, you'd need to show that all chickens you're working with are direct descendants of the velociraptor that you want to arrive at a close approximate version of, and you'd need to have the genome sequence of that velociraptor to be able to see, is that genome sequence peppered among its living descendants? And then maybe by selecting the kinds of chickens that have the traits that look the most like the velociraptor, so you've got the right, talons, the types of feet, and different aspects of its beak or what have you, that resemble that ancient version, and you select those and you breed them together over many, many, many generations. That is the logic of backbreeding that says, you could actually revert back in time through selective breeding to make some close version of that ancient one reappear. But it won't work if they're just simply related. You need to know that they are direct descendants of that missing ancestor.
Yeah, well, so like one of the examples that you give in the book of a extinct species that they are trying to bring back through this, recovering the genes of lost ancestors that I thought was interesting is the aurochs, which is kind of like this ancient giant ox kind of thing. And you want to talk about that? Like, talk about what's sort of the current state of that?
Sure. So the aurochs is the ancient ancestor to all of today's living cattle. So it's this really remarkable example of an animal with a genome that has been sequenced and is understood to be the direct forefather, if you will, of all the cows that we're living and working with today. So they went extinct in the 1600s. And now there are different groups set up in programs to try and breed them back. So it's a selective breeding approach based on looking just at their traits. What color were they? How big were they? What were their horns like? How were they shaped? And then observing the natural world of cows around them now. So if you can select the cattle lines that have the right horn shape, but maybe they don't have the right color, then you go over and select a different type of cattle that has the right color that you want, even if its horns are not exact. And you start crossing them together. And similarly, you would set up another breeding line for other traits that you want to establish in these quote unquote de-extincted aurochs that you're trying to make. And over time, with successional breeding through these selective measures, you start to get these cows that look like the extinct aurochs. And there has been a lot of success in this to date already, but it's not a new initiative. We can trace these types of endeavors back to German brothers Lutz and Heinz Heck, who during World War II times were also trying to recreate the extinct aurochs by breeding animals that were strong and stocky and had the same coloration. And they've been nicknamed Nazi super cows because of the contextual social environment they were made in. But now there are many heck cattle that live in Germany and other places, and then groups such as the Toros program are working to establish backbred aurochs with their own new types of cattle lines that are making different mate choices than what you see with the heck cattle programs, for example.
Mm-hmm. And see, now I was familiar just with the aurochs because it appears in George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones. And so I thought that was pretty cool. And then I saw in your book actually that he's actually contributing money to this, to some of these de-extinction projects.
So his name was one of the early ones to appear on the donor page at Revive and Restore's website. And Revive and Restore is this nonprofit organization headed by Stuart Brand, a pioneering environmentalist and visionary futurist and writer who's been looking for ways that technology can be propped up in environmental scenarios over decades. And his wife, Ryan Phelan, who is a biotech entrepreneur and one of the first to create a company that sold genetic tests directly to consumers, similar to 23andMe, which you see everywhere now, but hers is called DNA Direct. And they established Revive and Restore back in 2012 to try and create a space for transparent education about their ambitions to do de-extinction, and then to bring the researchers together from around the world who are working on de-extinction related projects to try and establish an actual field and a movement rather than just a mad scattering of experiments. And they need money in order to do this. So they collect donations, and yes, George R. R. Martin's name is there as one of the donors to their passenger pigeon de-extinction project. And when I spoke to the lead scientist on that, Ben Novak, he told me that the most interesting donor they'd seen so far was George R. R. Martin.
Well, it's interesting because I think that most people, they read Game of Thrones or watch the TV show and they don't realize that direwolves are an actual extinct species. So I wonder if George's long game is to try to get a pet direwolf.
Maybe, hey? I mean, de-extinction is so fantastical in its ambition that it makes sense that it attracts minds like George R. R. Martin, who have a really vibrant way of visualizing the world and the types of creatures that could inhabit it.
Well, right. And you talk about there's this scientist that you profile in the book named Ben Novak. And
Yes.
just as a fantasy and science fiction author, this quote from him jumps out at me. He says, everyone falls in love at some point in time with something that's imagined, whether that's unicorns or great armies of orcs fighting battles of good and evil. And here I was, a big Tolkien fan at that age, reading about flocks of billions.
Yeah.
He's talking about flocks of billions of passenger pigeons, but
Right.
that there is this sort of fantastical element to some of these lost animals.
Exactly. So when he first encountered the story of the passenger pigeon being this super abundant organism, it's really hard for us to fathom what it was like to interact with them, but they're the most abundant avian species that humans ever interacted with. There were hundreds of millions to billions. And, a single flock could take 14 hours to pass overhead. And there are records showing that one bullet shot up in the sky could make anywhere between 25 and 99 birds rain down because they were layered that thick as they flew. It is fairly unbelievable. However, he was learning at this ripe age of 13, while being a huge fantasy fan, usually reading about mythical creatures, that this species was not mythical, but it had the same kind of overwhelming effect of widening his imagination for what it would be like to live in a world with them. And he was very tragically moved to learn that, humans had killed them with their own two hands and seen them with their own two eyes, and yet he would never have the opportunity to interact with them. So there was a science fair going on at his school at that time, and he made his project about what it would take to get the passenger pigeon back to life. And that was a long time ago, because now he's my age and he is the paid lead scientist on that exact project to recreate the passenger pigeon. And he's extremely zealously passionate about this bird. He has written poetry about it and painted canvases with its plumage colors, and he's just incredibly dedicated.
And you say that they're actually planning to have a passenger pigeon by the year 2022, is that right?
That is what they have said as a target year where they can expect their gene editing experiments to produce the kind of birds that they would feel comfortable calling a de-extincted passenger pigeon. And of course, it's hard to put a real finger on when these experiments will succeed, but that's how long they think they need, because they have a pretty complicated method of gene editing to try and create them. Bird biology is pretty tricky to work with, and you can't clone birds, so they have this wildly inventive method that's going to take quite a long time to get right. But at the same time, 2022 doesn't sound that far off to me.
Right. And so with this genetic engineering, you're taking the closest living relative and knocking out the genes that are not the genes you want and sort of inserting the genes that you do want until you get something that kind of approximates the passenger pigeon.
Yeah, once you've compared the genomes between the closest living relative, the band-tailed pigeon, and then the extinct passenger pigeon, and you identify where those divergent parts of the genome are that mean what the passenger pigeon had that the band-tailed pigeon lacks was coded for in these areas where their genomes are different, and then you can, yes, exactly, edit the genes in the living bird so that they start to match more closely the extinct bird's genome. You can get close to the main equipment of what you need to make this bird come to life. However, you can't do that directly in the bird embryo and just have it give birth to a bird that looks like a passenger pigeon very easily. You need to actually edit these cells that will turn into the band-tailed pigeon sperm and eggs, called primordial germ cells. So you use a gene editing tool such as CRISPR, Cas9. You make all the genetic changes that you want in these cells that will become sperm and eggs in the living relative bird. And then at a certain moment after that bird lays an egg, you can hijack the embryo that it lays, cut a little hole in its shell, and then using a glass capillary needle, inject these edited cells that will become sperm and eggs into this developing embryo, close it back up, put it in an incubator, wait a little while, and then when it's born, it's going to give rise to a bird that looks exactly like a band-tailed pigeon, which is weird because Ben, by that point, will have done all sorts of fancy gene editing work to try and recreate the extinct bird. But the thing is that those birds that have hatched have a secret in their gonads, which is essentially that they're carrying passenger pigeon sperm and eggs. So then that generation needs to grow up, become sexually mature, and then when they mate with each other, the birds that they give rise to would be these passenger pigeons reborn, so to speak, that they expect to roughly get around 2022.
You say it became obvious to me that you have to be a glass half full type of person to do this work.
Yes, that's right. Because throughout the years that I was interviewing Ben about the research on the passenger pigeon's natural history and certain factors that were required for its abundance and survival and things like this, there were different implications of the research that was being discovered, which would change the outcome for people who wanted de-extinction to work. But every time that new research came in, they found a way to shift it so that, maybe it was still possible to de-extinction, even though it went against what they were originally relying on in order to make sure that it would be possible. And so there was a deeply rooted optimism to finding a way no matter what, even if sometimes the scientific evidence is showing you that it was no longer such an easy idea. So it really came with this passionate drive to make the passenger pigeon project work. I can get into the specifics of that if you want, because I'm sure that vague answer doesn't make much sense. It's just that.
Well, no, let's, I want to mention, because we've talked about, I want to cover the three different techniques. So we've got breeding and we've got genetic engineering, and then there's also cloning. And I think that most people think about the woolly mammoth is one of these kinds of animals that people are sort of aware could possibly be brought back. And I think that people think about cloning as being a good way to do that because we have frozen woolly mammoth bodies. So is that a talk about that? Is cloning a mammoth? Is that a good prospect?
Well, in order to do any kind of cloning, the first thing you need is a fully intact, perfectly preserved cell that has the nucleus inside with all of its chromosomes tightly packed up and not degraded at all. But when an animal dies, it starts to degrade at the cellular level. The pH changes inside cells, and then enzymes go bonkers and they cut up the DNA, and it starts to chip away into something that becomes harder and harder to work with. So in many cases, if you're talking about an extinct animal that disappeared long, long, long ago, it has been subjected to environmental decay for some time, which means that every time that you go and find a mummified version of it, the cells, even if sometimes they look like they're nicely preserved mummies, for example, of a woolly mammoth, the cell's integrity, when you get into the nitty-gritty of it, they're broken down in a way that makes cloning impossible, because you need that fully preserved nucleus with all of its DNA perfectly intact in order to then yank out that nucleus and put it into an egg cell that's donated from a close living relative. And then you can stimulate that to start dividing and implant it in a surrogate mother, for example, an Asian elephant, in order to grow a clone. But so far, even though there have been attempts from Japanese and South Korean research groups to clone a mammoth, there have been no perfectly preserved cells found in order to make that a realistic possibility. That's why George Church's group at Harvard are using a different method, which is this gene editing approach, similar to the passenger pigeon that we just chatted about.
Mm. So would you say that cloning is really only an option for animals that you have one that just died or that was really well preserved in liquid nitrogen or something like that?
Yeah, or an animal that you took cells from while it was still alive and you put them in a biobank somewhere. They've been freezing for a while, and if at a certain point that animal goes extinct, then at least you have those cells to work with because you had the wherewithal beforehand to preserve that tissue. This is exactly what happened with the Pyrenean ibex, which is also known as a bucardo, which is the one de-extinction that has happened to date. And this was in the early 2000s. 2 years before the last one died, researchers had the thought to take some cells from her ear and from her flank and freeze them. And so this animal, which was living in the Spanish Pyrenees, a type of mountain goat, eventually became so threatened that there was just one left, a female named Celia, and she had a radio collar that monitored her in a conservation program. And one day it gave out a weird signal, and the researchers rushed into the field to see what had happened, and they discovered that she'd been crushed to death by a branch that fell from a tree. But they had already frozen her materials. So that meant that 2 years later, they could use cloning to try and get that last individual back. And they were able, after many, many attempts, to produce a clone of Celia, but the clone only lived for about 10 minutes. It had a birth defect and a big deformity on its lungs that meant it couldn't thrive.
I mean, one of the things that I thought was really interesting in this book is that people are talking about bringing back the woolly mammoth, for example, not just because it's cool, but because it would help fight climate change. I thought that was really interesting.
The geoengineering argument of the woolly mammoth. Yeah, so George Church and his team have put forth a justification about why it might be a good idea to get the woolly mammoth back that relates to the Siberian steppe where they used to live and the effects of climate change there. So if you think of these Arctic environments that used to be populated with woolly mammoths, such as the Yukon up in Canada or Siberia, as mentioned, there are enormous amounts of permafrost that contain loads and loads of carbon sitting up there. There's estimated to be twice as much carbon locked in these permafrost stores than there is already in the atmosphere. But we're learning that permafrost is actually a pretty poor name to describe this material with because it's not permanently frozen. Things are getting warmer with climate change and these soils are thawing. And as they thaw, they release their carbon contents into the atmosphere. And there are microbes everywhere that chew away at this carbon and turn it into carbon dioxide and methane, which are two of the greenhouse gases that got us in this warming predicament in the first place. So it's of huge concern that we might have more runaway warming as these enormous, vast amounts of permafrost increasingly thaw and then eventually produce greenhouse gases from what they emit. And people are thinking, how can we keep these soils locked up and frozen? Let's try whatever ingenious methods we can think of. And now, these days, there's far less animals up there than what there once was during the Pleistocene, when there was just a much more bioabundant situation before the megafauna extinction happened, which was part of course, what happened when we lost the woolly mammoths in the first place. So there's a lot of snow for much of the year that isn't doing much except sitting there as an insulating blanket, because blankets of snow that are not disrupted can keep the ground warmer underneath than they would otherwise be if you had a bunch of animals, let's say millions of them, running around in the winter months looking for a blade of grass to eat, turning over the snow. So the hypothesis here is that having many, many recreated woolly mammoths or woolly mammoth elephant hybrids back that could move north and run around in these areas where there is thawing permafrost, they could punch holes in the snow with their big mammoth feet, basically perforating this insulating blanket of snow and then allowing cold air from the atmosphere to come down, hit the topsoil of the permafrost and promote some kind of refrigeration or cycling of frigid air. And then additionally, perhaps they'd be able to knock over dark plants that absorb the sun's heat and fertilize the soil with their dung, giving rise to light reflective grasses, eventually geoengineering that area back into what it was like more similarly during the Pleistocene. Mm-hmm. So in order to do this, you would need to have many, many animals to have any substantial effect. And George told me that in conversations with the scientists in Siberia that run a place called Pleistocene Park, Sergei Zimov is a man who started this decades ago. They came up with about 80,000 woolly mammoths as an ambition number for herds. So although that sounds, it's just, whoa, 80,000 woolly mammoths. We're going to make them in a lab and then put them up there. Sergei has Dr. Zimov has been doing experiments on the effects of trampling in this part of Siberia called Pleistocene Park, and noticed that a lot of trampling by currently available animals such as reindeer can cause about a 15-degree temperature difference. So there is some stock behind the idea that a lot of trampling from bioabundant populations of animals could do something to change the temperature of the soil.
I mean, did they talk? It's interesting to think, well, if they bring back the woolly mammoth as it was, that might be good for fighting climate change, but could you tweak it even into something that it never was that would be even better? I mean, could you make like a woolly mammoth with 6 legs or something, and that would be even better for stomping down the permafrost, right?
Yeah, more efficient.
Is anyone talking about anything like that?
Not that I've heard with any sincerity, although it's a fun idea when you just visualize a 6-legged mammoth.
I'll just throw that out there if there are any de-extinction scientists listening right now.
Yeah.
Because you do talk in the book that people are talking about sort of genetically engineering organisms, you say, that can produce biofuels, flavor, fragrances, or drugs. So these are obviously things that have never existed before. So
synthetic biology more generally allows this wild possibility for manipulating genomes of a wide variety of organisms. And a lot has been done, for example, in microbes, as you mentioned, creating fragrances and biofuels and new drugs and food ingredients and all sorts of things, because you can start to turn cells into laboratories of a sort, where if you rig up their genes in a certain way that you know that they will produce a certain set of proteins that are valuable to you that you can siphon off after they've basically been just doing their thing and dividing in a vat for a long amount of time, then you can harvest off some valuable products, whether that be a drug, a biofuel, or anything else.
You talk about there's this thing called the micro pig, which is sort of a genetically engineered pet pig that doesn't grow above a certain size.
Yes. So there is this company in China called BGI that produced this micro pig that was originally made for research purposes. You just could change some genes, and they did this with CRISPR, gene editing tool, in order to make a pig that is completely identical to the natural variety pig, except smaller. It didn't change any of their other genetic effects. And this was because the size of the pigs, they're very large, they're heavy, and they're kind of burdensome to work with in a research setting. If you're setting up different disease models that you want to test on them, for example, which is what I believe they were doing. So they made these tiny versions by changing just a few genes that they understood would have the effect. But then they also realized these are really cool pets and started selling them for roughly $1,600 US.
Because that's sort of an issue you raised, right? Is if we do bring back woolly mammoths or thylacines or, all these other things, are people just going to want them as pets? Or, sort of like the less idealistic things than fighting climate change. But, you can imagine, like people are going to want to hunt a woolly mammoth, or people are going to want to eat a passenger pigeon because apparently they tasted amazing.
Apparently they did.
People are really you're going to want to get in on this.
Yeah, there are a recipe I've now read for passenger pigeon pie that are from not even that long ago. So yeah, this is a question. I've had conversations with people who sincerely want to eat a salted woolly mammoth leg. Interesting. I mean, that would be so far from the grassroots interest of doing any kind of ecological restoration that people who are pushing de-extinction forward in research settings want to see happen. But due to the high degree of bioengineering that will be required to make many of these animals that are seriously being worked on, that means that in places like the United States, they won't be seen as a product of nature, and thereby they'll be patentable, which means that all sorts of things become possible when you consider deep pockets of certain people and how they might want to benefit from animals in unecological ways. There are lawyers who have been writing about this in the de-extinction space, asking questions of how we can use existing laws to protect animals from human exploitation that we might make with de-extinction. And one researcher who I met with a few times over the course of researching the book, Hendrik Poinar, the son of George Poinar Jr., the scientist who influenced Michael Crichton's science for Jurassic Park, is a woolly mammoth genetics expert. He's sequenced its genomes with his collaborators, and he was once taken out for a lunch with a rich business person over a $7,000 bottle of wine who offered to provide him a job if he would leave his academic post and join him on a mission to bring back the mammoth and open up some kind of theme park so that people could pay and come and visit these recreated marvelous beasts. And he turned him down and nothing went forward with the plan, but it just demonstrates that some people already have their minds churning of ways to capitalize off of this kind of research, even if those at the forefront of it have no interest in it going that way.
Well, I mean, because you could argue that it would be a good thing if people find a way to make lots of money, because that would fund the research. I mean, you see this sort of same dynamic a lot of times with safari parks and things where they let people, like big game hunters, come in and hunt a few of the animals for a gigantic amount of money, and then that money is used to keep the park going and keep all the other animals alive and protected.
That's right, yes. And Revive and Restore sees that there are ways captive breeding populations could help de-extinction efforts, for example, that it's not a black and white situation of, oh my gosh, if these animals are ever in captivity, then we're not doing good on the de-extinction promise. Because if you have a flock of passenger pigeons in a zoo, they could not only educate the public about what the science underlying de-extinction is and how it's changing natural history of the species, but they could also be a useful transitionary space as you're moving from the laboratory into the wild. And so they could actually be part of the release program for certain species, depending on what it is. And yes, you could recoup some of your costs is the thinking, because it won't be cheap to actually manage populations. And particularly when you're talking about conservation of rare, vulnerable populations, which is what de-extinction would produce, that you're going to have to get out into the wild. Those are long-term costs that don't have an end date. You can't budget that into a certain year or operational set of years, because you want them to go on living, and you need to find a way to pay for that over time. So yes, people have said that there's ways that maybe getting us to pay for enjoying them could be used in making them even possible at all.
Right, because it seems like people maybe overemphasize the downsides a lot of the times. You talk about how a lot of people just form their opinions about a subject like de-extinction from watching Jurassic Park. Yeah. And they just think, oh, well, I saw what happened in Jurassic Park, so obviously we don't want to do that. Where, if they made a movie where they de-extincted a species and everyone was happy, that's not a very exciting movie to watch. So they don't tend to make movies like that.
Right.
But I mean, do you think that people just that Jurassic Park has just really skewed people's perceptions of this subject?
I think it has. It is definitely the boilerplate for conversation that comes up again and again, even with people who have been, not thinking about de-extinction just for the first time. It's a very strong narrative. It's really taught us to think about the dangers of acting hubristically in the face of uncertain genetic science, and how nature will always overcome our attempts to control it. So there's also the issue of genetically modified organisms still being of huge debate for many people, and frankenfoods being a term of assault that people like to use to talk about GMO foods, for example. And that gets wrapped into the debate pretty quickly too, about how these are just some kind of Franken creation that we might be making with de-extinction. So yeah, pop culture narratives and overflow from what are actually very different scientific discussions, such as GMO crops, creep their way into de-extinction discourse all the time.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I kind of think like there's almost nothing in the natural world that hasn't been shaped by humans at this point. Even like I was saying, like dogs and cats and bananas, like everything have all been, massively changed from their quote unquote natural state by human activity over the last 100,000 years or whatever.
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah. But you did say that, maybe there might be some, I don't know, you say that 2 production companies have expressed interest in transforming your book into a film. Is there anything you can say about that?
De-extinction is this story world that just keeps on giving. It's interesting. I think it really fascinates all of us in a way, just because it seems like science fiction, and yet we understand that highly credible scientists are working on making it more and more of a realistic outcome of their work. So yes, there have been a couple of film companies who have approached me about turning this into a feature, but right now there is no production in the works, is what I can say.
Mm-hmm. You say that other people's species resurrection films are on the way. Are there any specific films that are?
Yeah, there's another book which came out last year called Woolly by Ben Mezrich, and it reads like a drama, but it was also written and very quickly, I believe the rights were bought to be turned into a feature film. And this will be a dramatic tale. It's not a documentary film, but it does focus on the work being done in George Church's lab to gene edit the elephant embryos into woolly mammoths.
So would that be a more kind of positive portrayal of de-extinction?
It's quite positive, yes. It seems to prop that project up as a heroic one, based on the book.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, if they did want to make another Jurassic Park style movie, this line kind of jumps out at me as something that would make a good horror movie. You talk about there was some period of time where there were, quote, marsupial lions, carnivorous kangaroos, a giant weird duck that ate flesh, and peculiar crocodiles that could scale trees. And that just sounds like
pretty amazing.
Sounds horrifying.
Yeah, it's so visually vibrant. Absolutely. That was in Australia.
Yeah. And then, like, you also mentioned another sort of horrifying possibility. This is just in passing, but you say, are there hidden pathogens in extinct species genomes that might be recreated along with the species itself?
Yes. So this is a concern that has been brought up by people trying to get ahead of the ball and make sure that we know what concerns could befall us with de-extinction. The International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which is that worldwide authority that says, which species are extinct and to which degree are they? They say which species are endangered and to which degree are they endangered, have declared that de-extinction is probably coming down the pipe, whether we like it or not. So let's create some smart guidelines to inform policy in responsible ways. And they've created this tier of scrutiny that they suggest any candidate for de-extinction has to pass through before it should be taken seriously as a species to really work on and recreate. And one of their questions is, can we ensure that there are no pathogens within this genome that we could somehow recreate and then unleash into an ecosystem today? But there's no research that I have heard of to show why this would happen with a particular candidate species. It's just that we need to be thinking about it before anything happens.
Mm-hmm. This line also jumped out at me. You're talking about, was it George Church? You say Church figured out how to encode an HTML version of a book, one he'd co-written, in a single drop of DNA through digital biological conversion.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so what's interesting about DNA's code, ACTG, is that it can very easily be converted to digital binary code, ones and zeros, just by ascribing 00 to A, 01 to T, 10 to C, and 11 to G, for example. And so you can have this direct, simple translation between anything that's created computationally that can be expressed as binary digital code and then DNA. So now there have been many experiments to show that things such as movie clips or photographic stills or entire digital books can be converted and stored in a DNA molecule, essentially, and then sequenced back out from that molecular form back into binary and experienced again in a computer and shows to work, to not have broken down or completely changed. Also, when you're just storing it in a molecule, you're not necessarily putting it in a cell, so it's not going to mutate and do all sorts of things. It can just sit there as an inert molecule, which opens up all kinds of possibilities for how we might store data in the future, particularly as we are generating so much more digital data all the time, and we need places to put it, and it's very energy expensive to store it the way that we currently do.
So could you genetically engineer a person or an animal or something that had like George R. R. Martin's Game of Thrones encoded in its DNA?
You could definitely get the code in the molecule, but in terms of putting that molecule into a person's cell, I do not know what the gene expression would be based on those codes. So we'd have to do some experiments to see if someone could actually live and have, functioning cells with all that kind of code in it.
Because isn't most of your DNA just junk anyway? It's not meaningful data?
A lot of it is junk, but there was also this really heavily defended idea that most of it was junk for a very long time, and then just a few years ago they started picking that apart and thinking, maybe it's not actually junk after all, we just haven't learned what it's doing. So it's an interesting space to watch for what people are learning about that.
And then I mentioned, I did want to also ask you, you're in this PhD program in science communication, and I was just kind of curious about sort of what sort of skills or experiences are you picking up in a program like that?
So before I came to this program, I didn't even realize that there was a whole world of academic scholars doing research about science communication, the effects of it, the relationship to politics or to society. I was just looking at it from a practitioner's perspective, making documentaries or whatever it might be. And then in this program, I've been able to get involved with this community of scholars that are actually analyzing, for example, the effects of certain science communication projects, or to look at how human values shape the way that different people can come to the exact same data sets about something like vaccinations, for example, or climate change, and leave believing totally different things about it, even though it's the exact same data, because it matches up with their worldview, biases, and values. So I've really been in this PhD looking at the scholarship around science communication. It's in an interdisciplinary program. And then I have been studying synthetic biology, the science communication of synthetic biology in this myself.
I mean, what do you kind of think about the current state of science communication? Because I just hear all this stuff about newspapers shutting down their science pages. And there are a couple science writing programs I know that have just kind of shut down because they say there aren't enough job opportunities for their graduates. I mean, kind of what's sort of the future of science communication?
Well, although there are instances like that, science communication is also professionalizing at an interesting rate, because more specialized grad programs are opening up to be able to give you a master's or a PhD in science communication, for example. And just as with the rest of journalism, it's a difficult space to be able to move out to and know that you'll have a job or certain opportunities. But you do see a lot of really creative approaches coming to the way that people are creating science stories, podcasting, live theater shows, science slams, traditional doc, everything to do with the YouTube generation of science communicators. I don't think that it's endangered in the way that we sometimes read about in articles that worry about its future. I'm working as a freelancer in it, I find that there's tons of opportunities to apply yourself, but I might have a really particular way of looking at it right now. I know that some programs, as you mentioned, are closing, but I see the cup kind of filling back up again by other ones getting off the ground.
Well, and speaking of podcasts, I mean, you've been doing some of your own podcasts. There's one I came across, first of all, called The Tympanic Eclipse.
Oh, yeah, The Tympanic Eclipse. Man, that's old. You did some digging. Nice. Yeah, so that
it just came up when I typed in your name. I didn't actually notice
really?
how old is it? Yeah.
Oh, maybe it's just following me around. Oh, that's funny. Yeah, that's a podcast that I made many years ago. And it was an attempt to explore where science and philosophy overlap. But I don't produce that anymore.
Uh-huh. Well, because I listened to one, you talked to this guy, Dr. Rupert Reed, where he's talking about, and this is an idea that I've had that I think is really important, but he says basically that in our legislatures and things, there's nobody representing the interests of future generations. So we just kind of trash the environment and do all these things for the short-term benefit. And he thinks it would be a good idea to have sort of designated representatives of future generations who can say like, okay, come on, we can't just, drill in the National Arctic Wildlife Refuge. We need to be thinking long term, not just making people happy in the present.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. We have this chronic short-termism in our political system and in our daily lives. And it's really creating an uncertain future. So I similarly found that pretty important when I found his research years ago. Thanks for reminding me of him. It's been a while.
Well, then let's talk about, you have a new podcast that just started, right? Tomorrow's World?
That's right. Yeah. With the BBC.
So how did that come about?
That was a wonderful day of receiving a phone call out of the blue where the BBC called and said that they were making this new podcast, and they invited me to be a part of it. Essentially, for over 40 years, the BBC had a television show called Tomorrow's World, which introduced Brits to new technologies before they were ingrained in everyday life. So the internet before it was really in everyone's computer rooms or cell phones, things like this. And sometimes they predicted the future in a way that really hit the mark of what happened, and sometimes they were way off, but it was a really playful and zany show. And then the BBC, along with a bunch of partners such as the Science Museum and other universities around the UK, have this year of trying to push science, storytelling, and education to mainly young people. They're trying to target millennials. And as part of this push, they wanted to recreate Tomorrow's World in a podcast form. So they invited an engineer by the name of Ellie Cosgrave, who's my co-host, and me to go on this wild ride, looking around at the future that could lay just around the corner from now, but we aren't sure of it, just like the Tomorrow's World television show wasn't sure about what was going to befall them, except we're not a gadget show. We're not looking at what future technologies could change our lives just in a really restricted sense. We're looking more at how the world's social systems and morals could change based on some technologies that we know are already realistic based on the scientists who are building them today. So we're looking at artificial intelligence, brain-machine interfaces, the future of coping with climate change, how we're going to manage outbreaks and pandemics in the future, privacy and the internet, for example, all sorts of different areas.
Yeah, so I listened to one of them. I thought the production values were pretty impressive. It's not just a talk show like this one. There's all sorts of cuts and audio from on location mixed with studio commentary and stuff like that.
Yes. Yeah, it's very heavily produced. It's a 3D binaural listening experience. So if we talk about Venus, we shuttle you out to Venus through sound effects and sound design. Our producer, Dave Dodd, is the one to be credited with all the hard work on how it sounds.
Yeah, no, it's really good. And so the episode I listened to was The Hope Floats, where it's about the prospect of creating cities that float on the ocean.
Right.
So, yeah, I'd recommend people go check it out because I thought that was a really interesting topic.
Oh, thank you.
And you interviewed Jeffrey Landis, who's a science fiction author. So it's a good bonus there for science fiction fans.
About that? Nice.
Yeah.
Nice.
Are you? I'm just curious. Are you a fantasy and science fiction fan yourself? Do you read much science fiction?
I'm sitting here with Jeff Vandermeer's book beside me, and I'm trying to get more into science fiction. It's kind of a project at the moment, but I wouldn't say I'm heavily versed. I like Ursula Le Guin, for example, and if you consider Margaret Atwood to be a science fiction author, then I've been reading her for years and others, and I
consider her to be a science fiction author no matter what she says.
Okay, cool. So, I'm definitely attracted to it, but I wouldn't say I'm up on all that's interesting in the genre right now. I'm trying to read more of it.
Is it Annihilation you're reading by Vandermeer or Born? Or?
Born.
Yeah.
Yes.
I haven't read that one yet, but yeah, Annihilation seems like it would be right up your alley. The weird nature stuff.
I've heard that one's good. I will check it out later. And I also just finished Change Agent last week, have you read that one?
Yeah, Daniel Suarez, I interviewed him about that book, yeah.
Okay, nice. Yeah, that was so entertaining for me, thinking about CRISPR as much as I do, to see him paint the whole future unraveling of it.
Yeah,
in
no,
a
there were
somewhat
so many
dystopic way. Yeah.
Yeah, there was so much great world building in that book related to genetic engineering. Yeah.
Really was.
All right, cool. So we're pretty much out of time. Do you have any other final thoughts or any other projects you want to mention or just anything you want to let people know about?
There will be an interactive documentary series coming forth sometime that we're going into production with in 2018 on human gene editing, which I'm excited about, so I can flag that as something to keep your eyes out for.
All right, cool. And so if people want to follow your projects and things, you're on Twitter or if, you have a website or stuff like that?
Yeah. It's just Britt Wray with 2 T's, BRITTWRAY.com. And same for my Twitter.
All right, great. Yeah, so let's wrap things up there. So we've been speaking with Britt Wray, and this new book, again, it's called Rise of the Necrofauna. So Britt, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
And that was our interview. So big thanks again to Britt Wray for joining us on the show. Big thanks as well to everyone who's continuing to support us on Patreon, even after this turbulent week. Remember that we're currently recommending that all Patreon supporters switch to giving us $5 per episode with a monthly max of $5, or $4 per episode with a monthly max of $4, etc. It's very important that you set your monthly max to the right amount, so if you want to confirm that you've done it correctly, please email us at geeksgalaxy@gmail.com and we can double check it for you. And remember that you can always make one-time or fixed monthly contributions to the show via PayPal over at geeksguideshow.com/crowdfunding. All right, so that was our show. So thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of Wired.com. For more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your host, visit davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by yours truly, Jack Kincaid. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.